Is my screen visible? Oh, perfect. So, before we begin, a little bit introduction about me. My name is Mohammad Hassan. I'm a Salesforce developer currently working at Salesforce, and I'm also um, have almost 2 years of experience working in Salesforce and in Salesforce ecosystem as a developer and as an associate developer. Before this, I was working as an application developer, working across multiple um, apps that included banking applications like HBL, Samba, and etc. So right now I'm working in Salesforce ecosystem, and I'm also basically I'm an avid gamer. Like most of you guys, I play Valorant, Dota 2, CS:GO, etc. Right? So we can now move to the next slide, which is basically thanking my sponsors, which made this session possible today. So I would really appreciate you guys to go and check out the websites and see how they were able to make this session possible. Okay, so the agenda for today's basic session is divided into three main parts, right? The first part is basically what is GraphQL API, and then we'll make some comparison with the GraphQL API and the RESTful API session that I really commonly use right now. And then we will basically be going on to the final part. The third part, which is included in this session, is the Salesforce basic plans with GraphQL API. And then we'll move on to this session, just a short demo. So if you just look at the definition which you can find on and just go on a basic research and see what exactly is GraphQL, right? It's basically an open source data query and manipulation language for APIs and a runtime for fulfilling queries with existing data. And it was basically developed internally by Facebook in 2012 before being publicly released in 2015 to be openly used. So that is the reason why we are now able to use this openly released to the public now. It basically allows the client to define the structure of the data required, and the same structure of the data is then returned from the server, therefore preventing excessively large amount of data from being and after listening to all of this, if you're like this and like really confused like me and really worried what is going on, don't worry. I'll try to explain in the simplest term what basically GraphQL API is in this remaining session, right? But before we actually go into GraphQL API, what we can also do is take a step back and try to understand how the modern infrastructure of web application works, right? And most of the modern infrastructure is basically dependent on API. So let's go and try and understand what an actual API is. So instead of using words, I'll be using an analogy which most of you guys have already seen uh, in uh, in really a lot of places, right? Let me just check if it's still following, and I'm basically just using the slideshow. So is everyone still following? Is there any confusion right now? We'll obviously have a question session at the end, but you guys still following right now. You guys should see the screen, right? Hello, is here? Let's go back to the slide. So this is a common analogy that's being used in most of the places, right? So if we consider our system, any web application system, as a kitchen or a restaurant, right? A whole restaurant basically comes as to you as a whole system that you can read, right? It's considered Facebook, right? We can take that system and see that this is Facebook, right? And that Facebook is basically a restaurant. So the front end basically would then be basically the chairs and the sitting ratio that we see, right? And that's basically the website that we scroll across all the whether it be mobile application, laptops. So that is the front end, and the back end is actually where our logic resides, where all the functionality, all the data of it resides. And if we take the example of that, it's basically sort of like a kitchen, right? Where all of the food is being processed, all of the items that we consume are being made there, right? So if we take that example, the APIs would then be the servers, right? The creators would basically be taking the order from the front end and then taking it to the kitchen. Then once the food is prepared, all the data and all the logic movements being done, it takes it back to the front end, which is being served to you, right? So this is actually, I feel, a pretty good analogy using API. What are the different types of API protocols and architecture that were very commonly used apart from GraphQl right now and existing? So this, as I previously mentioned, SOAP, RPC, and REST. These are some of the widely known, and from all of these, REST is actually one of the widely, like most of the people in the session already know REST, right? But we'll elaborate a little bit more on that, right? How REST works and what actually REST is. So let's see what REST is, right? Because for the sake of the session, we need to have a comparison between REST and GraphQL. So we'll see what REST is in this session. So if we see what actually REST is, this is not actually REST as in taking a rest. This is actually a procedure, right? What exactly is REST is actually it's a type of architecture that lays the rules for making an API call, right? It follows, so the REST architecture dictates that it should have whatever the API that's being made, it should have a uniform interface, right? So it should be basically be using a certain set of rules, right? So those rules can be easily found on the internet, but I'll elaborate on a little bit of those, right? Uh, it basically says that like identification of the resources, right? Let's say if you want a certain information from this website, right? This any API that follows the REST architecture would need the identification to be really really clear. Okay, it basically needs the manipulation of resources through representation, right? If we use, most of us have used REST API. If you've seen any REST API, I'll even show an example of REST API in the following slides, right? But it basically has sort of like messages of service, right? 200, 400, right? So any API that's RESTful, it basically needs those. So this is the first part of REST architecture, right? The second part is that it's server based, right? So what it does basically is it it basically separates the concerns of the backend and the front end. So any person who's working on the backend needs to take care of every single thing that the API would return, right? So the REST API usually returns a JSON format. It's very flexible. It returns multiple formats. But what when a person from front end makes a REST call, REST API call, it basically means that all the responsibility of handling and returning the data now lies upon the server side of the things. The backend side of things will handle each and everything. It will handle the request and it will return it back. And then the third point of the REST API is basically it's stateless. It does not maintain its state. So this could, in some instances, be taken as an advantage, and in some instances, this could also be taken as a disadvantage. So in what sense it could be taken as a disadvantage? Let's say you are trying to have a e-commerce website, right? And you want to manage your cart, right? Uh, the cart basically is something that moves across web pages, right? And in that sort of scenarios, a state is really important to maintain because let's say you put in items from one web page and then you go to another. So that for that, it's really important that you maintain those state. So, and in other criteria, it's more of an advantage because you don't actually need to maintain the state in multiple in the other use cases, right? So, and then lastly, it's basically a layered system architecture, right? So, let's say you have multiple components, right? So, a layered architecture dictates that each component cannot see beyond beyond the immediate layer that they're interacting with. So, this basically allows for some sort of security when using REST API. So, REST and RESTful are two widely terms that are used for REST APIs. So REST is basically the architecture that this follows, the architecture and these set of rules that are defined. And RESTful APIs are all those APIs that basically follow this architecture. So there's not any difference between REST and RESTful. Right? So now we know a little bit about APIs, a little bit about the API history, etc. We can go back and try to understand a little bit more about what we actually got. Is if we see is now if it's from our current understanding of the RESTful API, we saw that there's some issues that we discussed, right? For example, that the API, that the data that it sends is very restricted. It's all done by back. What GraphQL basically is, it if we see it's a data query and a manipulation language for APIs. So the front-end developer have more power, right? We can actually see what they want from for a specific web page or a specific website, and they can query actually what they want from the server backend. So the backend server side person will now have to write resolvers. There's something called resolvers on the backend side, and they actually need to resolve those queries sent by the front end. So the power now lies at the client side. The client or the front end developer basically can manipulate the language that they want and can get the data they want at runtime. So this is actually leading back to our next point, the client side basically. It now allows the client to define the structure of the data that they need, and the same structure of the data is then returned from the server. So this has some advantages and also some disadvantages, which we'll discuss in the next slides, right? Now we actually know what is REST and what is GraphQL. We have a slight bit of idea of both of these. Just let me check if you guys have any questions. Uh, if I'm audible, guys have, am I going too fast? Am I going too slow? Or is this fine? I think we'll keep the questions to the end. But for now, I just want to take a quick break and see how everyone is playing. The session raffle is already shared with you guys, so you guys can click on it and basically participate in the session. And I'll go back to my session and discussion. So, if you compare REST versus GraphQL, right? REST is a widely accepted API that's used by most of the applications that we use, and it's been around since 2000, and it still remains one of the most popular approaches to implementing web services today. And REST APIs are really reusable, right? And what it allows developers to independently work on microservices that work independently of one user, right? And the third point of RESTful is it allows caching. So this is in terms of web application, this is something really important for some instances. So for now, their support for caching is much better with the REST API as compared to GraphQL, and it comes out of the box. For the GraphQL API, right? If you compare GraphQL API, its basic is defining feature is the schema, right? You can actually define what type of data and queries you want, and then you front-end developers don't actually need to concern themselves with the backend, right? Sorry. Let's say there's a person who's a front-end developer who multiple things, and he won't have to go back to the backend developer and say, okay, I want this from now from a list of products, and then now you have to change the uh, uh, basically API again and make this so that I can get this specific data for this use case. The backend developer would make a huge product. Let's say a backend developer needs to send a list of products, right? He would make a product backend and a database, and then basically write resolvers for all the for basically write resolvers for GraphQL. The front end developer would then say, okay, I need this product, and from each of the product he can specify I want the name of the product or ID of the product. He can get exactly what he wants, right? So the next defining feature is GraphQL API is relatively easy to start. It's really easy to get started. You don't have to be an expert with web services architecture or HTTP protocols, etc., etc. If you literally Google how to start writing in GraphQL API, it's really fairly simple. You can even find online basically compilers, and which will basically show you and allow you to make GraphQL. It's fairly easy. And the third defining feature of a GraphQL is precision, right? You can retrieve exactly that you're looking for. So you can say that the first and third point is actually sort of like correlating with each other, right? Now we can actually move on and see the sample um, queries or requests, let's say, for a traditional REST or a GraphQL. I've basically used the same data set so as to give you guys a fair understanding that if we actually look for some use cases, there aren't many differences. The end result of REST versus Graph, you could actually achieve the same things, right? So if we take this example right now, if you take this example, the data body, if you can see, so the top part is basically the web callout, the web callout link that you'll be calling. And even if you see that, it doesn't have a lot of references. The only difference you can see is in the rest. It's in the end, it's continents slash continent, and in GraphQL, it's at the end, it's slash GraphQL. And in the request body that you're sending, right, it's data, contents, name, countries. So like it's not really different. So why GraphQL then? Why do we actually need GraphQL? Like what actually is the reason for going to GraphQL? Why don't you just continue RESTful API? Why go with all this effort and try and come up with a new form and learn new API language, right? This is exactly my question. Why GraphQL? So basically, this which we actually discussed previously in the slides previously, the main reason for using GraphQL API is overfitting and underfitting data, right? So what RESTful API does, it it's really hardcoded from the backend. If you go back here, if you send this request body, right, it's really what you can do with this API, right? And you cannot change this API from the front end unless you go back and make another API. You need multiple APIs. So let's say if you want just the country's name and capital from this request body, right? You want to have, let's say, country Pakistan, and so the name would come here, and then the next thing would be its capital, Karachi. So if you want the list of those, this would actually, if you send this request body, this would actually overfetch that data, because what the way that the REST API is defined is it should always have the continent's name first. It should always have the country name, capital, and currency. So uh, this would always be fetching all these details, right? You cannot manipulate it anyway. And for the sake of APIs, if we're discussing the modern web application structure, this can severely affect the speeds at which the modern front end applications are working, right? You can see microseconds even if you're using a phone and um, any website, a delay of microseconds can be really annoying. So let's say if something that we click and it takes, let's say, 1 or 2 seconds, that would be actually really boring and nobody is going to use that website anymore. So if we take the example of GraphQL, right? If the person on that server needs to only display countries, he can actually query this and then remove all of this excess data, right? He can actually remove the contents, he can remove the name, and then he can remove even the currency. And what this GraphQL backend resolver will do, it will take this and say, okay, this is a query which needs only the countries and the name with its capital. That's it. So you don't overfish data. In the same manner, you don't underfish data as well. If this is the same query, right? And we say this, the person was like, okay, I actually want, let's say, not just continents, also want the whole world, right? Planet Earth, planet Jupiter, Mars, whatever, right? He actually, the person at the backend added planets into this as well, right? So if this is the way that this is defined, right, the person will not be able to call those in the same manner, and as we discussed for the countries, right? I hope I'm making sense to you guys, and you guys can uh, getting why the reason of why we need to actually go and why there's actually need for using GraphQL. The second reason, which basically is which why I come across personally, and which one of my friend working in a recent startup came across. So they have actually an application which has a single backend, right? And they have an iOS device, and they have an Android device, Android front end, and then they have obviously the laptop or website front end, right? They're using the single backend, a backend server to call make, which basically provide data to three different frontends. So the issue basically was they wanted to get data from a specific product, right? But the issue was for each different application front end, the request that they wanted to get, the responses that they wanted to get, and the products they wanted to display at each different front end was different. So there was if they were using the RESTful API structure right now, what they would have to do is actually write three different APIs in order to accommodate those three results, right? This would actually increase the load on the server side and actually did basically be really so the server would become really clunky, and the server would be getting, because instead of just one API to handle those three, it now has to basically resolve three different APIs, right? So what they did was they moved to GraphQL, and now they basically wrote one product table which had a resolver function in it and mutation. Obviously, this is something that you guys should um, look into yourself, right? This is sort of like a homework for you guys to look if you guys are interested in exploring GraphQL more. But for now, I can just tell you guys the result of what it did was basically the product part of this had basically one product table, and it had resolvers written on the back end. The front end application now had to basically query the data that they wanted and get the data that they needed, right? So it wasn't, it was basically giving them the exact data that they needed for each of the front end. And they only needed to make one single GraphQL API instead of three different RESTful API. So if there's an overall comparison, it's not like GraphQL is now going to replace RESTful API each and everywhere, right? It's still in its starting phases. It's a relatively new architecture, and the reason I believe is it's not ever going to replace REST is it has very specific use cases. RESTful API is still a very powerful, very fast, and robust API architecture, which is basically being used across multiple web application. And it's going to continue to be used but this is something that we did new. And the reason for why I decided to choose this topic was basically something that came across my side when I was studying one of the release of Salesforce, right? So this is basically the third part of this. Salesforce basically has announced to release GraphQL API into beta. So by summer 22, you can actually, I'll pin this developer blog to for you guys to read as well. But what basically is happening, I'll also get in this. This is the post. Hello. You may get. Yeah, can you? So for sales after the release of summer 2022. And as you can see, if you go to the Salesforce platform API, you can clearly see this um, GraphQL. And as you can see, this is still in beta. And here, if you go to this, you can basically use this API to objects and make us to S objects for
Hi,
specific.
Omar. Hello. Sorry to interrupt you, but there's a lot of noise and interference at your point. Can you please try changing your headset or something? Thank you. Thank you everyone for who are watching. Just Umar is just gonna join back again. Please save this.
Can you guys hear me?
No, that is still the case. Sorry. Do you have another headset or something you can try?
Yeah. Hello. Uh,
It's still the case, Umar, that is still having this noise issue. Um, Probably we're going to join back again, so just stay tuned with this. Thank you.
Hello, guys. Can you hear me? Is this better?
Um, Hi, Umar. Yes, this sounds a lot better now.
I'm so sorry. Was the whole session like this? I actually asked people in the session, but there was no response apparently. So,
No worries at all. And also, I recommend you to keep your mouth, I mean, mic a little closer, or maybe speak
okay.
loudly, so that will be better for the recording as well.
Okay. Okay. Perfect. Thank you so much, Hamza. I think we are towards the end of
Oh, it's
it
still the
now.
same case. I'm sorry. Still, there's a voice.
Uh, how, can you tell me what sort of voice is there a noise coming from the background or
There's
is there
also
any
some background noise, and also there's the glitches in your voice when you're speaking up.
um, is okay? Let me
I would
see.
recommend if you have anything other than, I mean, other than this session is going on your internet on your PC, please close that so that your memory resources can be utilized less on your PC.
Yes, I haven't used anything else. This is the only thing that's running. I'll try and
Okay,
switching
that's
my
strange.
internet connection. 1 second. I will try. I will disconnect and reconnect. Give me 1 second and just let me know if it's better.
Right. I'm gonna maybe join it back again.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, it's more better now.
Oh, I think there was an internet issue, maybe. Um, if this is better, should I continue the session then?
Yeah, please go ahead. And audience,
Okay,
please confirm if Umar is audible now for you guys. And I'm gonna leave to Umar. Thank you, Umar, for joining, and be sure
thank you
to
so much.
run the raffle at the end of it.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Hamza. Thank you so much. Okay, guys, let's continue towards this session. I am going to now share my screen. Mm, So as I was telling you guys, right? This is basically the Salesforce developer, basically API. So this is actually you guys can go and import this workspace from Salesforce API, and as you can see, this is the GraphQL API that is basically now available for the platform. Here you can now see the UI and this. I don't think we need intro section, but for UI, as we can now query standard objects right from here using the GraphQL API, which we discussed throughout this session, right? So I'm now going to share my screen and basically be moving towards the second part of the session, which is showing you guys how to make a GraphQL call out through Salesforce, right? um, I would now. So what I've done is actually I've done some prerequisite steps that are required for this, and for the first step, we actually need to add remote site settings for for the server that we're trying to call. So I basically used a GitHub repository, which basically allowed me. There was a project on GitHub that basically allowed me to make a GraphQL request to a server, and that server had a simple site URL. So I needed to add those two here. I added them to here in the GraphQL, and since they're here, we can now use them in our callouts, right? This is a prerequisite step that is basically needed by any callout that we make when we are using Salesforce callout, right? Um, Once you've done that, what I'll do is instead of writing down a class, I actually have written down this on an execute debug console, right? So this package basically allowed me to make my own GraphQL nodes within Salesforce as well. So instead of just calling out to a server, we're also going to see how we can make this using this specific package. I'll attach the link to that specific GitHub package in this session at the end of the session as well. Don't worry, it's at the end of my slides as well. But for now, we can just focus on one thing. We saw it in the slides, right? That this part, right, the countries and the name, we were basically seeing this in the presentation, right? If you go back and scroll a little bit here, I'm basically trying to create the same data on that server from within Salesforce. So if we go back to here and we're only going to execute this part, right? And we're going to basically execute this part and see the debug log, right? For this. Uh, what happened right now, if we go step by step to this, is basically, uh, if we go back to open exam. So what we're doing right now is basically created a countries node, and we call this package that we installed basically by the name of GraphQL node. So this, what it did is it takes a parameter of countries, and it takes basically the next parameter that it needed was what fields that this would have, right? And then we took another node. So as you can see in this presentation, this has a country's name, the country, and then it has another node by the name of um, capital, right? And which has ID and name. So this basically generates uh, a sort of JSON within that server, right? We're going to now query this, and uh, we're going to make this into, we're going to call this server out right now, since it's basically, this package allows me to make this query nodes on that server. I'll now run the rest of the code and then explain the later part of the code as well. So for now, I'm just executing this code, right? And I'll also debug this. Oh, so I think we'll have to run the whole code. So instead of just running a part of the code, I'll explain the rest of the code as well, right? So we actually needed to have a wrapper class in order to basically get the response and then wrap it around, basically use the wrapper class to store that data in Salesforce, right? The normal process would, if we take the normal process of calling, we would have in Salesforce, it basically would have a trigger condition. Let's say we want this query to be made, we want this call out to be made on account creation or an account updation. So we'll have that trigger. And then the next part would be a future method, because we cannot have API callouts in synchronous mode. This is a very well-known fact, because API callouts take time, and since our code gets executed sequentially, if we have that done sequentially as well, and the response from the API callout does not get returned within the same time, then it will cause a code to crash. So this is a conventional followed in anywhere, right? Where we make API callouts, we need to make API callouts in an async class, right? So that what will happen is our code will run sequentially, and whenever the part for the API callout comes, we make that part of the code run asynchronously. So what will happen is the code would then ignore that API callout and move to the rest of the code. And once we'll have once that API callout part is run in an async code, we can then take the information back from that and then use it in the response body. Usually it's saved in a response body, and then we can use it in the rest of the code. So in Salesforce, there are different types of async methods, but usually for simple API callers, we can use the future method, which will then return our response in the future. But for now, the main focus is just to see how basically this queries from GraphQL would return in Salesforce, right? Since this is just an introductory session, we're not going to actually go and make all this coding practices, because it will it would need a lot of time for all those different coding classes and coding practices. So for the sake of simplicity and the time, we are going to just execute this simple code and see. So for now, because my goal for this session was to just give you an insight of how this web caller would look, I would actually needed a GraphQL server, but since I didn't have that, so I used this GitHub project, which basically deployed my code to a certain server, which was free to use, and it also allowed me to query that back, right? If you go back to a code, what it does is it basically allows me to call. This basically is sending, it's like an HTTP request that we make in Salesforce for a REST API as well, and we basically built a request from here, right? This is from the package itself. If we remove this package, we can write this own code ourselves, but for the sake of simplicity and understanding, I use this package so that you guys can understand how this callout is working, right? So the request basically is generated through query build.request. This I can show you this class as well, but you guys can look at it in your own time. I'll link the GitHub project at the end of the slide. And as you can see, if we go back to the request body, right here, 1 second. This is basically then returning as a country, and then it's basically returning as capital city, which ID is 1, name is Moscow, then the name is Russia, basically the country's name is Russia, and then it's basically returning. So the data at the server side that server side is Bermuda. It has so 2 different countries and 2 different capitals, 3 different countries and 3 different capitals. So I hope I was able to give you guys some understanding of how GraphQL work, what GraphQL is, why GraphQL is needed, and how to make simple GraphQL callouts to from Salesforce. These are the links that I used for this presentation, and the GitHub that I was mentioning is also attached here. You guys I can paste this in chat if you guys want to. If you guys want to check this out, you guys can check this out. So the last part is, I guess, session questions. Do you guys have any questions for me? I will try my best to answer.